My name is James Whitmore. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in corporate compliance, the department most people forget exists until something goes wrong. If you met me in person, you probably wouldn't remember me 5 minutes later. I'm not loud. I don't command rooms. I don't interrupt. In meetings, I'm usually the one taking notes while everyone else talks over each other. People have described me as steady, reasonable, or my personal favorite, safe. Safe, in corporate language, often means predictable, manageable, non-threatening. At home, it wasn't much different. I've always believed that calm is a form of strength. I grew up in a house where raised voices meant broken things and slammed doors, so I learned early that the quietest person in the room usually survives the longest. I built my life around that principle: steady career, steady routines, steady marriage. From the outside, my life looked stable, successful, even. My wife was charismatic, ambitious, magnetic in ways I've never been. She thrived in high-pressure rooms. People admired her. I admired her. And for years, I assumed that admiration was mutual. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic confrontations or explosive betrayals. There was no screaming match in the kitchen, no shattered glass, no public spectacle. It was quieter than that. It started with a sentence my wife delivered casually, almost playfully, during an argument that barely qualified as one. She told me that if I ever made things difficult for her, she could ruin my career. And she said it with the kind of confidence that suggests someone has already imagined how. I don't think she expected me to remember that moment as clearly as I did. I don't think she expected me to treat it as information instead of emotion. And I certainly don't think she expected what I did next. The investigation that followed didn't go the way she expected. But this isn't a story about winning. It's about documentation, timing, silence, and the quiet difference between reacting and responding. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, including the parts where I doubted myself, the parts where I almost ignored the warning signs, the parts where staying calm felt like swallowing glass. Because sometimes the most powerful move you can make isn't loud. It's early. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought your silence meant weakness? To understand what happened, you need to understand who I was to the people around me. At work, I was the steady one. That's how my director introduced me to new hires. If you need clarity, ask James. If you need something done right the first time, ask James. It sounded like praise. And in many ways, it was. But there's a subtle hierarchy inside that compliment. I wasn't the visionary. I wasn't the rainmaker. I wasn't the bold strategist whose ideas shaped quarterly goals. I was the safety net, the person you call after someone else makes a mess. Compliance isn't glamorous. It doesn't generate revenue. It prevents disasters. And when disasters don't happen, no one notices you were there. That was my lane. I didn't mind it. I actually preferred it. Predictability meant control. Control meant peace. At home, I occupied a similar role. My wife, Lauren, was the opposite of me in almost every way. She worked in business development, polished, persuasive, fearless in negotiations. When she walked into a room, conversations shifted toward her. When I walked in, conversations continued. At dinner parties, she told the stories. I refilled glasses. When friends needed advice about career moves, they asked her. When they needed someone to help review a contract quietly and thoroughly, they messaged me later. It wasn't disrespectful, not overtly. It was just positioning. Lauren used to joke that I was her stability anchor. She'd say it affectionately, squeezing my arm in front of people. James keeps me grounded. I'd be a disaster without him. Everyone would laugh, and I would smile, because anchors are important. But anchors also stay in one place while ships travel. Over time, I realized something subtle. In group settings, Lauren began speaking for both of us. If someone asked what we thought about buying a new property, she answered before I could. If someone asked about my job, she'd summarize it in simplified terms. He basically makes sure companies don't get sued, she'd say, waving her hand. Basically, that word does a lot of quiet minimizing. I told myself it didn't matter. She was just being efficient, socially fluent. I've never been quick with casual banter. She filled the silence naturally. That was one of the reasons I loved her. But there's a difference between someone feeling silence and someone assuming ownership of it. At work, I was careful with documentation. Every recommendation I made was supported by policy. Every compliance concern was archived. I never sent emotionally charged emails. I never reacted impulsively. My name carried weight internally because it was attached to precision. At home, though, I didn't document anything. I trusted the emotional infrastructure of our marriage the way I trusted company policy. I assumed it was stable because it had always been stable. Looking back, that was my blind spot. People tend to underestimate men like me. Quiet, methodical, not visibly ambitious. The assumption is that we lack leverage because we don't display it. Lauren once told a friend thinking I couldn't hear James would never make waves. He hates conflict too much. She wasn't wrong. I do hate conflict. But hating conflict and avoiding responsibility are two very different things. If you had asked anyone in our circle who held more social power, they would have said Lauren without hesitation. If you had asked who was more likely to protect their reputation with surgical precision, they wouldn't have thought to ask that question at all. Because in their minds, I didn't operate that way. I was safe, predictable, manageable, and for a long time, I let them believe that. The first time she said it, she smiled. That's what stayed with me. It wasn't a fight. Not really. It was a Thursday night in late October. Rain against the windows, dishes half done. We were arguing about something ordinary, a networking event she wanted me to attend the following week. I need you there, she said, pacing slightly. It matters. I have a regulatory review deadline Friday morning. I replied, if I go, I won't be sharp the next day. She exhaled, frustrated but controlled. You're always choosing work. I'm choosing responsibility. That's when she paused. Not angry, calculating. Just remember, she said lightly, almost playfully. My network overlaps with yours more than you think. If you ever decide not to support me publicly, I could make things very complicated for you. She said it like a tease, like a clever remark. Then she smiled. Most people would have dismissed it as sarcasm. I almost did. But tone is something I pay attention to professionally. In compliance interviews, when someone says, "Oh, that wasn't a big deal," what matters isn't the words. It's the microsecond hesitation before them. Lauren didn't hesitate. She wasn't venting. She was informing. I didn't respond defensively. I didn't accuse her of threatening me. I simply looked at her and said, "Complicated how?" She shrugged. "Relax. James, I'm kidding. God, you're so literal." And just like that, the moment was socially reframed. If I pursued it, I'd look paranoid, humorless. So I let it go. But I didn't forget it. That's the difference. Over the next few weeks, I noticed something subtle. When we were around her colleagues, she started referencing my company more often, specific departments, executive names, information I'd shared casually at home. At first, I assumed it was a harmless overlap. Seattle's biotech community isn't enormous. Then one night, at another event, one of her associates laughed and said to me, "I hear your compliance team is deflexible when the right partnerships are involved." He said it jokingly, but he shouldn't have had that impression at all. I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger, not yet, just awareness. Later that night in the car, I asked her about it. She rolled her eyes. "It was a joke. Don't be dramatic." "I don't joke about compliance integrity," I said calmly. She stared out the window. "You really think I'd sabotage you? That's insulting." That wasn't what I'd said. And that was the first small cut. Not the comment at dinner, not the smile, but the reframing, the suggestion that my concern itself was offensive. Professionally, when someone shifts a question back onto you emotionally, it's often a deflection strategy. I've written internal training modules about it. At home, though, I wanted to believe it was miscommunication, so I rationalized. She's ambitious. She networks aggressively. She exaggerates sometimes for leverage. That doesn't mean she'd actually do anything harmful. Still, I started doing something small. I began keeping my leather portfolio in my home office instead of the living room. Not because I distrusted her, because I was adjusting. There's a quiet moment when your brain stops arguing with your intuition. That Thursday night was mine. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no slammed doors, just a sentence delivered with confidence, and a smile that lasted half a second too long. The human mind has a remarkable ability to smooth sharp edges, especially when the alternative is admitting something uncomfortable. After that night in October, nothing exploded. There was no escalation, no obvious betrayal. Life continued in its polished, functional rhythm. We hosted friends. We split chores. We discussed retirement contributions and vacation plans. And yet, something subtle had shifted. It started with language. Lauren began correcting me in public gently, almost playfully. If I explained a regulatory concept at a dinner table, she'd interject. What James means is, and then rephrase it in simpler, slightly distorted terms. People would nod at her version. If I disagreed with her about a business trend, she'd laugh and say, "He's very conservative. That's his job. Conservative, risk-averse, predictable, each word accurate in isolation." Together, they built a portrait, one where I was cautious to the point of irrelevance. The first few times, I brushed it off. Marriage has friction. Ambitious personalities sometimes overtalk. I reminded myself that she operated in high-stakes rooms where confidence was currency. But repetition has weight. One evening, we were at a small gathering hosted by one of her colleagues. The conversation drifted toward ethical grey areas in partnership deals. Someone joked, "Sometimes you just have to bend the rules." Lauren smiled and glanced at me. "Not in our house," she said. "James would write a 10-page memo about it first." Everyone laughed. I smiled too. But what they heard wasn't that I had standards. They heard that I was rigid, slow, overly cautious. Later that night, as we got into bed, I asked her quietly, "Why do you frame it like that? Like what? Like I'm an obstacle to momentum." She sighed, already tired of the conversation. "James, it's social shorthand. It's not that deep." There it was again. It's not that deep. That phrase does something powerful. It implies that the concern exists only because you're overanalyzing. The issue is your perception, not the behavior. And because I am analytical by nature, I question myself. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I was projecting professional instincts into personal spaces. Maybe the threat I thought I heard in October had just been stress. So I adjusted. I became quieter at events. I volunteered less information about my work. I stopped correcting subtle inaccuracies when she described my role. If she wanted to be the narrator of our shared life in public, I let her. Conflict avoided, peace preserved. But here's what I didn't realize at the time. Silence doesn't neutralize narratives. It reinforces them. At work, I would never allow someone to misrepresent policy repeatedly without clarification. Even small inaccuracies, left unchecked, become assumed truths. Yet at home, I treated perception like something flexible. One afternoon, a colleague of mine, someone I trusted, pulled me aside after a joint networking lunch Lauren had attended. "She's impressive," he said. "Very persuasive." I nodded. He hesitated before adding, "Just make sure you're aligned. She speaks very confidently about internal processes." That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. Aligned. It was a professional word, a careful word. It wasn't an accusation. It was a caution. That's when I realized something else. Lauren wasn't just minimizing me socially. She was borrowing authority from proximity, using my credibility as scaffolding for her own positioning, and every time I stayed quiet, I validated the structure. I didn't confront her again immediately. I told myself I needed more clarity, more context, more certainty. But deep down, something colder was forming. Not anger, not yet, just documentation. Because when patterns repeat, they stop being accidents. They become a strategy. And strategy requires response, not emotion. There's a moment in every dynamic where you realize you've been cast. Not invited, cast. It happened quietly, the way most important realizations do. No dramatic reveal, no argument. Just a pattern finally coming into focus. Lauren and I were at a charity fundraiser downtown, one of those polished hotel ballroom events with soft lighting and curated conversations. She was in her element-tailored dress, effortless confidence, gliding between executives like she'd memorized the room in advance. I stood beside her during introductions, offering polite nods, measured handshakes. At one point, a senior partner from a venture firm asked about an upcoming regulatory shift in biotech oversight. It was directly within my area of expertise. I began answering. Halfway through my explanation, Lauren gently touched my arm. "What James is saying," she interjected smoothly, "is that there are hurdles, but nothing that can't be navigated creatively." Creatively. That wasn't the word I'd used. It wasn't the word I would ever use in that context. The partner smiled at her, intrigued. The conversation pivoted away from compliance safeguards and toward opportunity angles. I fell silent, and in that silence, I understood something uncomfortable. My role wasn't a partner. It was a validator. I was there to provide quiet legitimacy, to be the stable husband whose presence suggested structure and ethics, while she shaped the narrative. On the drive home, I didn't confront her. Instead, I asked a different question. "Do you see me as cautious?" She laughed lightly. "You are cautious. That's not what I asked." She glanced at me, then back to the road. "You're reliable. You think things through. That's your strength." Strength. It sounded complimentary, but it carried boundaries. Reliable people aren't disruptive. They don't escalate. They don't surprise you. Over the next few weeks, I began observing interactions through a different lens. When disagreements arose privately, she'd frame them in terms of image. "We need to present unity. It wouldn't look good if you contradicted me. People trust us as a team. Us. But alignment, in practice, meant my silence. I had been assigned a role, the measured husband who wouldn't challenge publicly, who would smooth edges afterward, who would prioritize stability over confrontation. And to be fair, I had played it well, because part of me believed that harmony was inherently virtuous. What I hadn't considered was that harmony can also be leveraged. One evening, during a minor disagreement about an upcoming partnership she was negotiating, she said something that clarified everything. "James, you don't understand how these rooms work. You're not built for that kind of pressure. Not cruel, not shouted, just stated." I didn't argue, because arguing would have validated her premise that I was emotionally reactive. Instead, I filed the statement away mentally. Not built for pressure. She believed my calm was avoidance, that my restraint was fear. She saw my silence as a limitation. What she didn't realize was that pressure reveals character differently depending on the arena. In her world, pressure meant persuasion. In mine, pressure meant precision. And precision is patient. By then, I had stopped defending my image socially. I had started protecting something else instead. Access, information, timing. The role she assigned me, reliable, useful, invisible, came with one overlooked advantage. Invisible people are rarely monitored, and people who believe they understand you rarely prepare for you. I didn't challenge the role. I refined it, because sometimes the most strategic move isn't to reject the part you're given. It's to master it so thoroughly that no one sees you step off stage. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen at a gala or over dinner with colleagues. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, alone in my office, staring at an email that wasn't meant to alarm me, but did. The subject line was neutral. Routine. Even. A brief inquiry from someone in our legal department asking whether I had recently advised any external parties on regulatory positioning related to partnership acceleration. That phrasing mattered. External parties. Partnership acceleration. I hadn't. My role was internal compliance oversight. I didn't consult externally. I didn't offer informal guidance outside approved channels. That boundary was one of the reasons leadership trusted me. I walked down to legal instead of replying digitally. Tone is harder to misinterpret in person. "Hey," I said evenly. "Can you give me context for that email?" The associate looked slightly uncomfortable. "Oh, it's probably nothing. We just heard secondhand that your name came up in a conversation about flexible interpretation windows." Flexible interpretation windows. That wasn't my language. "Where did that come from?" I asked. She hesitated. "I think through Lauren's network, someone mentioned that you'd indicated certain review thresholds weren't as rigid as they appear." There it was. Not an accusation, not formal, but circulating. I felt something settle inside me, then not panic, not anger. Clarity. I thanked her. Calm. Professional. I told her I'd send a written clarification to document my position formally, just to prevent confusion. She nodded, relieved. Back in my office, I closed the door. For a long time, I simply sat there. Up until that moment, everything could have been interpreted as social positioning, ego, narrative control, harmless exaggeration. But this crossed into professional territory. In compliance, perception is currency. Even the suggestion that I might advise flexible interpretations could compromise my credibility. And credibility, once questioned, is rarely restored fully. I opened my leather portfolio and began writing not emotionally, not reactively, just facts. Dates of events Lauren had attended. Conversations where she referenced internal processes. The October comment. The networking lunch. The fundraiser. Not conclusions, just documentation. That was the shift. I stopped framing the situation as marital tension. I started framing it as a risk assessment. If a colleague had come to me describing this pattern, third-party references to internal processes, informal claims of flexibility, reputational overlap, I would advise preemptive clarification, not confrontation. Documentation. So that's what I did. I drafted a concise email to legal and copied my direct supervisor. Calm tone, direct language. To clarify, I wrote, I do not provide external advisory opinions regarding internal compliance thresholds. Any external interpretation of my position is unauthorized and does not reflect company policy. No accusations. No mention of Lauren. Just a boundary, placed early. I reread it 3 times before sending. Then I leaned back in my chair and felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because I had escalated, but because I had aligned my response with my values. For months, I had been trying to preserve emotional harmony. That Tuesday, I chose professional integrity instead. When I came home that evening, Lauren was on the phone, laughing, energized. She ended the call and smiled at me. How was your day? Productive, I said. That was true. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse her. Because something fundamental had changed. I wasn't trying to win an argument anymore. I was managing exposure, and the difference between those two mindsets is enormous. Later that night, as she scrolled through her phone beside me in bed, I realized something else. If she was confident enough to imply leverage, she might believe she already had it, which meant I needed to understand exactly what she thought she could use, and I needed to do it quietly. That Tuesday wasn't explosive. It was surgical. It was the day I stopped assuming goodwill was mutual and started verifying it. After that Tuesday, my silence wasn't instinctive anymore. It was deliberate. There's a difference between staying quiet because you dislike conflict and staying quiet because you're observing. Lauren didn't notice the shift at first. Why would she? On the surface, nothing about me changed. I still attended events when necessary. I still listened more than I spoke. I still deferred publicly when she redirected conversations. But internally, I had moved from trust to verification. At work, I formalized habits I had previously treated as routine. Every advisory conversation was summarized in follow-up emails. Every meeting note was archived with timestamps. Any external reference to compliance interpretation was documented and clarified immediately. No drama, just paper trails. I also adjusted something subtle at home. I stopped sharing details that weren't necessary, not out of spite, not to punish her, because information, once loosely shared, had proven capable of drifting. If she asked how a regulatory review was progressing, I gave high-level responses. Standard. On schedule. Nothing unusual. She didn't question it. If anything, she seemed pleased. My reduced elaboration made her social summaries easier. One evening, she returned from a dinner visibly energized. You'll love this, she said, dropping her bag on the counter. I may have accelerated a partnership track. They're open to pushing review timelines. I looked at her carefully. Within policy, she waved her hand. Don't get technical. That phrase again. Don't get technical, as if precision were an inconvenience. I nodded slowly. I won't. She smiled, misreading my tone as agreement. But silence, when chosen strategically, does something powerful. It creates space. And in that space, people often reveal more than they intend. Over the next few weeks, I noticed she spoke more freely about her negotiations, more confidently, occasionally referencing insider understanding without specifying sources. Each time, I logged the date mentally, not because I was building a case against her, because I was mapping risk. Silence also changed how others treated me. At a small executive lunch, someone mentioned the idea of creative compliance interpretation, again the same language that had surfaced in legal's inquiry. This time, I didn't let it float. Calmly, without looking defensive, I said, to be clear, our thresholds are fixed. Any suggestion otherwise is inaccurate. The room shifted slightly. No one challenged me. Later, my director sent a short message. Appreciate the clarity today. 3 words, but they mattered. Lauren, meanwhile, began assuming my quiet meant surrender. During a minor disagreement about attending another event, she said lightly, You've been more cooperative lately. I like it. Cooperative? The word landed differently than she intended. She believed my restraint meant alignment. She didn't recognize it as an assessment. There's something almost dangerous about being underestimated by someone close to you. They stop scanning for resistance. They stop anticipating pushback. They grow comfortable. Comfortable people overextend. I didn't escalate. I didn't confront. I watched, and I prepared, because if she truly believed she could make things complicated for me, then at some point, she might test that belief. And when she did, I needed to be positioned correctly, not emotionally, but structurally. Silence, when unconscious, is vulnerability. Silence, when chosen, is leverage. By then, I had fully transitioned. I wasn't trying to fix our dynamic. I was ensuring that if it fractured, I wouldn't be the one exposed. And the quiet irony, the calmer I became, the more confident she grew, which meant the real reveal was getting closer. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed. Not Lauren, not her colleagues, not even most of mine. They saw the same man arriving at work at 7:45, the same leather portfolio under his arm, the same measured tone in meetings. What they didn't see was how deliberate everything had become. In compliance, we're trained to think in contingencies. If X happens, what documentation exists if Y is alleged? What proof refutes it? We don't prepare because we expect wrongdoing. We prepare because we understand exposure. I applied that mindset to my personal life without announcing it. First, I requested a formal review of my last 3 performance cycles, not because I needed it, but because I wanted consolidated documentation. My director was surprised, but supportive. "Everything okay?" he asked casually. "Just cleaning up files," I replied. The reviews came back consistent. High marks for integrity. Strong language around ethical consistency. Notes from senior leadership about uncompromising standards. I archived copies at home and digitally. Second, I began separating professional communication channels more clearly. If someone from Lauren's network reached out, which happened occasionally, I redirected them through official pathways immediately. Happy to discuss through proper channels. Please loop in legal, neutral, procedural, logged. Third, and most quietly, I consulted an external employment attorney. Not to file anything, not to accuse anyone, just to ask questions. Hypothetically, what constitutes reputational interference? Hypothetically, what documentation matters most if informal claims circulate hypothetically? How should one respond if a spouse implies professional leverage? The attorney listened carefully. His advice was simple. If you believe there's even a small risk of reputational manipulation, you document early and disclose appropriately. The person who reports first shapes the narrative. Report first. The phrase lingered. I wasn't ready to report anything, but I understood something crucial. Timing determines credibility. Meanwhile, at home, Lauren grew bolder in subtle ways. One Saturday morning, I overheard part of a call from her office. The door was partially closed, but her voice carried. "He's risk-averse, but I can navigate him," she said lightly. "He trusts me." There was laughter on the other end. I stood in the hallway, not reacting, just absorbing. Navigate him. It wasn't the disrespect that struck me. It was the assumption she believed she understood my boundaries fully, that she could predict my threshold, that if pressure ever came, I would prioritize harmony over exposure. She didn't know I had already shifted frameworks. That afternoon, I updated my personal journal, something I hadn't kept consistently in years. I documented dates, direct quotes when I remembered them clearly. Context. No embellishment. Documentation isn't about building ammunition. It's about preserving memory accurately before emotion distorts it. I also began observing something else: her confidence when referencing my company. At a private dinner with 2 of her associates, she casually said, "I have insight into how compliance would likely respond." Likely respond. Predictive authority. Afterward, in the car, I asked gently, "Do you ever worry about speaking on behalf of departments you're not part of?" She smiled, almost indulgently. "James, that's how influence works." Influence. Another word that sounds neutral until you examine its mechanics. Influence built on implication can become liability. And here's what no one noticed. I never accused her. I never demanded she stop. I never threatened consequences. Externally, I remained the same steady presence. Internally, I was constructing insulation. There's a discipline to preparing without escalating. It requires swallowing the urge to correct publicly. It requires resisting emotional reactions that might tip your hand. Most people assume power is loud. It isn't. Power, in many cases, is alignment between knowledge and timing. By the end of that winter, I had something I didn't have before. Not proof of wrongdoing, Not evidence of malice, but a pattern. A documented pattern of implication, exaggeration, and perceived leverage. And one more thing. Clarity. If she ever decided to test her October statement, if she ever tried to make things complicated, I would not respond defensively. I would respond first, quietly. Because what they never noticed was this: I wasn't preparing to attack. I was preparing to remove ambiguity. And ambiguity, once removed, leaves very little room for manipulation. The discovery didn't come with a dramatic confession. It came through a forwarded email, not to me, to her, and she didn't mean for me to see it. Lauren was in the shower one evening when her laptop, open on the dining table, chimed with a notification. I wasn't in the habit of checking her devices. Privacy matters. Even then, I believed that. But the subject line was visible from where I stood. Re-leveraging internal flexibility call recap. My name wasn't in it. My company was... I didn't touch the laptop immediately. I stood there, listening to the water running down the hallway, weighing something internal. Curiosity is not justification, but context matters. If this had been about her own firm, I would have walked away. It wasn't... I opened the email. The thread was between Lauren and two external partners. The language was polished, strategic, and careful. She referenced a reliable internal read, suggesting that certain compliance thresholds could be navigated with relationship-based discretion. Reliable internal read. That was me, not directly named, but implied. There were no explicit lies, no forged statements, nothing overtly criminal, just positioning. She was using the proximity of our marriage to imply access and flexibility that didn't exist. And in business, implication is often more powerful than assertion. I scrolled further. One line stood out. If needed, I can confirm appetite informally before formal submission. Confirm appetite. Informally. That crossed a line, not because it meant she had done it, but because she was offering the perception that she could. I closed the laptop exactly as I had found it. No confrontation. No raised voice when she stepped out of the shower. Towel wrapped around her hair. How was your evening? She asked casually. Quiet, I replied. And it was... But internally, something had crystallized. Until that moment, I had operated in probabilities. Now I had confirmation of intent. Not malicious intent in the cartoon villain sense. Calculated intent. She believed proximity equaled leverage. She believed my reputation was an asset she could deploy. And perhaps most importantly, she believed I wouldn't act first. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was angry, because I was thinking through structure. Emotionally confronting her would accomplish nothing. She would deny implication, reframe it as networking shorthand, accuse me of overreacting, and if I reacted without preparation, I would validate that narrative. Instead, I asked myself one question. If this email surfaced publicly tomorrow, what would protect me? The answer wasn't confrontation. It was a disclosure. In compliance, we are trained that undisclosed conflicts of interest are more damaging than conflicts themselves. Perception of undisclosed access can be as harmful as actual misconduct, which meant I had a choice. Ignore it and hope her confidence never turns into a test. Or disclose preemptively, not accusing her, but clarifying boundaries formally. Disclosure would trigger questions. Questions would trigger a review. Review would create a record. And record, once created, changes power dynamics permanently. The next morning, I arrived at work earlier than usual. I opened my portfolio and placed the notes I'd been compiling over the past months in front of me. Then I drafted a summary memo. Neutral tone. Objective language. I outlined observed instances where external parties referenced my name or department in ways that implied informal advisory flexibility. I attached nothing yet, just context. At the bottom, I wrote a single line. For transparency, I believe it is appropriate to document this pattern proactively to prevent reputational ambiguity. I didn't send it immediately. I reread it 3 times, because once sent, there would be no undoing it. No quiet return to normal. The investigation that would follow might be minimal, or it might not. But one thing was certain. If anything surfaced later, I would not be reacting defensively. I would be the one who documented first. And in professional ecosystems, the first documented account often becomes the foundation for all others. When Lauren kissed me goodbye that morning, she had no idea that the leverage she thought she held had just shifted. Quietly, permanently. There's a specific kind of silence that follows clarity. It isn't confusion. It isn't fear. It's inevitability. That morning, with the draft memo open on my screen, I understood something fully for the first time. Whatever I chose next would permanently redefine my marriage. Up until then, I had preserved optionality. I could still confront her privately. I could still pretend I hadn't seen the email. I could still step back into the familiar rhythm of minimization and rationalization. But disclosure would remove that option. Once compliance and legal had formal awareness of potential implied conflicts tied to my personal relationship, there would be a process. Process meant documentation. Documentation meant visibility. Visibility meant scrutiny, not of wrongdoing but of association. I listed my options, the way I would in any risk assessment. Option 1, do nothing. Hope her implied leverage never escalated into formal misrepresentation. Preserve marital harmony. Accept ongoing reputational vulnerability. Option 2, confront her privately. Demand she stop referencing internal processes. Risk denial. Risk argument. Risk alerting her before any formal boundary existed. Option 3, disclose internally without accusation. Frame it as proactive transparency. Accept that an inquiry might follow. Accept that she would eventually learn I had reported the pattern. Only one of those options protected my professional integrity completely, and it was the irreversible one. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. This wasn't about punishing her. It wasn't about catching her. It was about removing ambiguity before ambiguity could be weaponized. There's something important that people misunderstand about calm individuals. We don't avoid decisive action because we're weak. We delay it because we understand its weight. I opened my eyes and reread the memo one last time. I added a final paragraph. I am not alleging misconduct. However, given the proximity of personal and professional networks, I believe preemptive clarification protects all parties involved. All parties, including her. That mattered to me. I attached screenshots of the legal inquiry from October, notes from conversations where my name had surfaced externally. No mention of the email I saw on her laptop, not yet. Just a pattern. Then I addressed it to my direct supervisor, head of compliance, internal legal counsel. Subject line: proactive disclosure. External references to internal compliance interpretation. My finger hovered over the trackpad. This was the moment. Not dramatic, not explosive, just quiet and final. Once sent, I would no longer be reacting if something surfaced. I would be the source of record. I thought about October, the smile, the sentence: I could make things very complicated for you. Complicated relies on surprise. Documentation removes surprise. I clicked send. No sound. No alert beyond the soft whoosh of a dispatched email. And just like that, the decision was made. The rest of the day passed normally on the surface. Meetings, reviews, routine discussions. By late afternoon, my supervisor responded. Thank you for flagging this. Let's schedule a brief review tomorrow. Calm, professional, exactly what I expected. When I came home that evening, Lauren was excited about an upcoming strategy call. She talked animatedly over dinner, outlining expansion possibilities. I listened, because nothing had happened yet, but something had begun. Investigations don't start with accusations. They start with questions, and the person who asks first controls the frame of those questions. The next 48 hours would determine whether this stayed a quiet clarification or evolved into something neither of us could reverse. But one thing was certain. If consequences emerged, they would not be because I reacted emotionally. They would be because I acted early. And early action is rarely the move people expect from someone they consider harmless. The meeting the next morning lasted 23 minutes. I remember the exact length because when you're calm, you notice time differently. My supervisor, head of compliance, and a legal representative sat across from me in a small conference room with glass walls. No tension, no accusation, just curiosity. Walk us through your concern, legal said. So I did, measured, structured. No emotional adjectives. I outlined the pattern: external references implying interpretive flexibility, the October inquiry, repeated use of language like creative navigation, and informal confirmation attributed to proximity. I didn't speculate about motives. I didn't mention my marriage beyond the necessary context. I want this documented, I concluded, so that if any perception of informal influence surfaces later, there's clarity that I neither authorized nor participated in it. There's something powerful about being the first to frame a narrative. Instead of defending myself against a rumor, I was protecting the company from ambiguity. That distinction mattered to them. Legal asked a few procedural questions. Had I provided any informal guidance? No. Had anyone approached me directly for threshold adjustments? No. Was I aware of specific deals in question, not beyond public information? They nodded. We'll conduct a quiet review, the head of compliance said. This is likely precautionary. Precautionary. Exactly what I intended. When I left that room, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. At home, nothing shifted visibly. Lauren continued her calls, her networking dinners, her confident commentary about momentum and opportunity. If she sensed anything, she didn't show it, which told me she didn't expect scrutiny. That was the second advantage of moving first. Over the next week, subtle things began happening internally. Legal requested archived communications tied to partnership acceleration proposals. Standard procedure. Routine on paper. But patterns reveal themselves under review. I wasn't included in every detail of the inquiry, and I didn't ask to be. That restraint was intentional. If I hovered, it would look defensive. Instead, I did my job. Precisely. Consistently. Meanwhile, I made one additional quiet move. I scheduled a meeting with an HR advisor framed as a general consultation about navigating professional boundaries in dual network marriages. No complaint. No allegation. Just questions. How do you recommend documenting situations where a spouse operates in overlapping professional circles, I asked. The advisor appreciated the proactive approach. Transparency early prevents misunderstandings later, she said. That phrase echoed my attorney's advice. Report first, clarify early. Lauren, meanwhile, began referencing my company less frequently in conversation. At first, I wondered if it was a coincidence. Then, during dinner one night, she mentioned casually, your legal team has been asking odd questions around town. I kept my tone neutral. About what? Nothing major. Just due diligence stuff. She watched my face carefully. I didn't react. Standard, I said. She studied me a second longer, then changed the subject. That was the first flicker, the first hint that the air had shifted. Investigations don't announce themselves loudly. They create pressure quietly. Phone calls that feel more formal. Emails that are slightly more precise. Partners who ask for written confirmation instead of verbal assurance. Lauren was entering that space now, and she didn't know why. That's the difference between confrontation and strategy. Confrontation alerts the other party immediately. Strategy lets reality do the revealing. I didn't celebrate. I didn't anticipate a downfall. Because investigations aren't about revenge. They're about alignment. If everything she implied was harmless exaggeration, the review would conclude cleanly. If it wasn't, then the record would show that I had drawn boundaries before anyone forced me to. By the end of that week, I received a short message from legal. We may need to interview your spouse regarding the reference statements. We'll keep you informed. I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop. The investigation had moved beyond precaution, and it was no longer operating quietly in the background. It was about to become visible, just not in the way she expected. Consequences rarely arrive like storms. They arrive like drafts. Subtle shifts in temperature make you reach for something warmer without knowing why. Lauren felt it before she understood it. Her calls became shorter, more clipped. She paced more when speaking. The confident rhythm she usually carried, that fluid certainty, began to stutter in small, almost imperceptible ways. One evening, she ended a call and stood still in the kitchen for several seconds, staring at nothing. They're being unusually procedural, she said finally. Who? I asked. Two of the firms I've been working with. They're requesting written clarification on things that used to be assumed. Assumed. I nodded slightly. Clarification is standard when the stakes rise. She studied me. You've always liked that word. Standard. I didn't respond. Because what she was experiencing wasn't personal hostility. It was a structure tightening. Over the next few days, more subtle signals surfaced. A meeting she expected to finalize was postponed. A partner asked for formal confirmation that no internal influence existed. Another mentioned that legal departments had become sensitive recently. Sensitive. That word means scrutiny. She never directly accused me of anything, but I could see the calculation beginning behind her eyes. The first real crack appeared on a Thursday night. She closed her office door, something she rarely did at home, and made 3 calls in succession. Her tone was controlled but strained. I never represented it that way, she said on one call. There must be miscommunication. On another. And finally, of course there's no conflict. When she emerged, she didn't look angry. She looked unsettled. What's going on? I asked evenly. She hesitated. There's some kind of review happening on your end. I didn't lie. There's a standard inquiry regarding external references to internal compliance interpretation. Her eyes sharpened. You reported something. Not shouted. Stated. I disclosed a pattern of implication. I replied, proactively. Silence filled the room. For a moment, I saw it clearly, the realization settling in. I hadn't confronted her privately. I hadn't warned her. I had documented first. You could have talked to me, she said finally. I did. I answered calmly. Multiple times. Her jaw tightened slightly. That's not the same as filing something. I didn't file a complaint. I said, I clarified boundaries. And that was true. The investigation wasn't punitive. It was procedural. But the procedure, once activated, removes ambiguity. Over the next week, she was contacted formally. An interview. Questions about the language used in negotiations. Clarification on whether she had implied internal access. She tried to downplay it initially. They're just covering themselves, she told me. But covering themselves meant something else, too. It meant distancing. And distancing meant that the leverage she thought she held proximity to my credibility was dissolving. I never raised my voice. I never said I told you so. Because this wasn't about being right. It was about being protected. One night, she sat across from me at the dining table, hands folded tightly. Do you know what this could cost me? She asked quietly. I know what ambiguity could have cost me, I replied. That was the closest we came to confrontation. No shouting, no dramatic ultimatums, just two professionals, suddenly positioned on opposite sides of the process. The irony was almost clinical. The sentence she had delivered casually in October, I could make things complicated for you, had inverted, not because I attacked, but because I removed the possibility of surprise. Consequences don't always look like public collapse. Sometimes they look like an opportunity narrowing. Phone calls are less enthusiastic, invitations less certain, confidence slightly fractured. And once doubt enters professional ecosystems, it spreads quietly. The investigation hadn't concluded yet, but one thing was already clear. The ground she thought was solid beneath her was shifting, and she hadn't seen it coming. Panic doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like negotiation. Lauren didn't explode. She recalibrated. A week after her formal interview with legal, she began initiating conversations differently. Softer tone, longer pauses. Questions are framed carefully instead of confidently. Maybe I was too casual with language, she admitted one night, standing near the kitchen counter but not quite sitting down. You know how rooms are. People exaggerate. I watched her quietly. Exaggeration had been the shield for months. Now it sounded thinner. They're reviewing call transcripts, she added, almost as an afterthought. Not just mine. Industry-wide tightening. Apparently. Industry-wide. It was easier to believe in a broad tightening than a targeted one. But she knew. And I knew she knew. What are you worried about? I asked calmly. She exhaled. That this looks intentional. Intentional. That word carried weight. Was it? I asked. She looked at me, not defensive this time. Not dismissive. Calculating. I never said you would bend rules, she said carefully. I implied understanding. That's not misconduct. No, I agreed. It's implication. The room felt smaller. She walked to the window and folded her arms. You've always been so rigid about language, she said quietly. I didn't think you'd treat it like betrayal. That was the first time she used a word close to the truth. Betrayal. But not in the dramatic sense. Not infidelity. Not cruelty. Strategic overreach. I treated it like exposure. I replied. Silence again. Over the next few days, she attempted something else. Repair. She sent follow-up emails to partners clarifying that she had no formal or informal influence over compliance decisions. She reframed previous statements as enthusiasm misinterpreted. Damage control. But once an internal review is initiated, timing matters. Clarifications after scrutiny begins don't erase earlier positioning. They highlight it. Her tone shifted at home. 2. Less confident, more measured. Occasionally resentful. You blindsided me, she said one evening. I documented first. I answered, that's the same thing. It wasn't. Blindsiding is an emotional ambush. Documentation is structural positioning. The difference lies in intention. I hadn't aimed to hurt her. I had aimed to protect myself. But protection, when it removes someone else's leverage, can feel like an attack. The formal findings arrived 3 weeks later. No evidence of direct misconduct. No proof of rule bending, but documented instances of language implying undue influence. Her firm issued an internal advisory, a warning about representational boundaries. A note was placed in her personnel file. Not termination, but not invisible either. Opportunities that require unquestioned credibility don't tolerate grey areas. Well, that night, She sat across from me at the dining table again, the same place where she had once smiled and warned me about making things complicated. "This didn't have to escalate," she said quietly. I met her gaze. "It escalated the day you believed you could use my reputation as currency." Her shoulders lowered slightly. For the first time, she looked less like a strategist and more like someone recalculating their own narrative. "Can this be undone?" she asked. "No," I said, not harshly, just honestly, because once a review exists, once interviews are logged, once advisory notes are filed, history doesn't disappear. It integrates, and that's the part people misunderstand about early action. It doesn't explode. It crystallizes. She wasn't ruined. Her career wasn't destroyed. But the unchecked confidence she had carried the assumption of invisible leverage was gone. And that absence was permanent. By the time she understood the full weight of it, the window for private correction had already closed. Quietly, irreversibly, the final conversation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in our living room on a Sunday afternoon. No raised voices, no dramatic ultimatums, just two people sitting across from each other in the quiet aftermath of the process. Lauren had received formal confirmation from her firm that the matter was closed. Advisory issued. Expectations clarified. No further action for now. For now. That phrase lingers longer than termination. She sat upright, hands folded, posture composed but not relaxed. "I need to understand something," she said evenly. "When you sent that disclosure, were you trying to protect yourself? Or were you trying to teach me a lesson?" The question was calm, clinical. "I was protecting myself," I replied. "And the fact that it affected me, I knew it might." She absorbed that without flinching. "You didn't warn me." "I did," I said quietly. Her brow tightened slightly. "When, in October, when you said you could make things complicated for me." Silence. The sentence hovered between us, no longer playful, no longer abstract. "That was frustration," she said. "It was information." I answered. There was no anger in my voice, just a fact. She leaned back, studying me in a way she hadn't in months. "You changed after that?" "Yes." "How long had you been preparing?" I didn't answer immediately. "Since the first time my name surfaced in legal," I said finally. Her lips pressed together. "So I was under observation in my own marriage?" "No," I said calmly. "You were under verification." The distinction mattered to me. Observation implies suspicion. Verification implies a boundary. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air wasn't hostile. It was clear. "You know what hurts," she said eventually, "that you were capable of this level of strategy. And I didn't see it. That's because I wasn't strategizing against you." I replied, "I was aligning my actions with my values." She gave a faint, almost humorless smile. "You always hide behind that word. Values." "I don't hide behind them," I said. "I stand inside them." Another silence. "This one is heavier." "Do you trust me?" she asked. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accusatory. It was almost academic. "I trust what you choose to prioritize," I said carefully. "And what do I prioritize?" "Advantage." The word wasn't cruel. It was accurate. She didn't argue. Instead, she asked something else. "Is this the point where you leave?" I considered the question honestly. "I don't know yet." I said, "But this is the point where the illusion ends." No explosion. No threats. Just acknowledgement. Because what had fractured wasn't love in the cinematic sense. It was a symmetry. She had believed she understood the full range of my capacity. She had mistaken restraint for inability. And once someone sees that they miscalculated you, the dynamic can't return to its original shape. We didn't resolve everything that afternoon. We didn't decide the future. But we clarified one thing completely. I would not absorb reputational risk to preserve emotional comfort. And she would never again assume my silence meant compliance. The confrontation ended the same way it began. Quietly. No door slamming. Just two people sitting in the clear light of consequences. And clarity, unlike anger, doesn't fade overnight. It's been a year since the investigation closed. A year since the advisory note was filed. A year since the sentence that once felt playful revealed itself as structural. People sometimes expect a dramatic ending to stories like this. Divorce papers, public fallout, a clean break. Life rarely resolves that cleanly. Lauren and I didn't separate immediately. We entered something quieter. Recalibration. The most noticeable change wasn't in her. It was in me. For most of my life, I believed strength meant endurance, absorbing tension, preserving harmony, taking the long view, while others reacted emotionally. There's dignity in that, but there's also danger. Endurance without boundaries becomes silent permission, and I had given silent permission for a long time. not for betrayal, but for minimization, for narrative control that edged too close to misrepresentation, for the assumption that I would always prioritize peace over positioning. That assumption is gone now. At work, my reputation strengthened, not because anyone celebrated what happened, but because early disclosure signals integrity. Leadership entrusted me with broader oversight responsibilities. I didn't seek them. They arrived naturally, the byproduct of consistency under scrutiny. The irony isn't lost on me. The very quality she thought she could leverage my steadiness became the reason I gained more institutional trust. At home, the dynamic shifted permanently. Lauren speaks more carefully now when referencing my work. Not out of fear, but awareness. There's a difference. We've had difficult conversations since then, not heated ones, just honest ones. About ambition, about perception, about the thin line between influence and overreach. She once told me, months later, "I never thought you'd move first." I didn't either. I admitted, that's the truth. I surprised myself. Not because I acted aggressively, but because I acted early. I no longer confuse calm with passivity. I no longer believe that protecting peace requires absorbing risk. And perhaps most importantly, I no longer need to be underestimated to feel safe. If anything, I'm more transparent now, more direct, not louder, just clearer. People sometimes ask me carefully whether I regret how it unfolded. I don't. Regret implies I acted impulsively. I didn't. I aligned with my code. Document before you defend. Clarify before you confront. And never allow ambiguity to define your integrity. Lauren and I are still navigating what trust looks like after a structural imbalance. It's slower now, more deliberate, but it's real. And if it doesn't hold long term, that outcome will be decided in clarity, not assumption. Who I am now isn't dramatically different. I'm still steady, still observant, still calm. But there's a quiet addition. Certainty. Not about control, not about dominance, but about this. Silence is only strength when it's chosen, not when it's imposed. And I choose mine. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that power rarely announces itself. It whispers, it hides in tone, in implication, in small sentences delivered with confidence. And sometimes, it hides in your own restraint. For months, I believed I was protecting my marriage by absorbing discomfort quietly, by minimizing small cuts, by allowing narratives to slide because correcting them felt unnecessary. But here's what I understand now. Unchallenged implication becomes assumed truth, and assumed truth, left unchecked, becomes leverage. Lauren didn't wake up one day planning to sabotage me. This wasn't a villain story. It was a miscalculation story. She believed she understood my limits. She believed my calm meant compliance. She believed proximity to integrity was the same thing as ownership of it. And I believed peace required silence. We were both wrong. The investigation didn't destroy her career. It didn't destroy mine. What it destroyed was ambiguity. Once everything was documented, clarified, and placed under light, there was no more guessing about who stood where. And clarity, while uncomfortable, is cleaner than suspicion. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. You don't have to raise your voice to protect your name. You don't have to humiliate someone to establish a boundary. And you don't have to wait until you're attacked to act. Sometimes the strongest move isn't retaliation. It's documentation. It's timing. It's stepping forward before someone pushes you. I'm not proud that it came to that. But I am proud that when the moment required alignment, I didn't hesitate. Because integrity isn't loud. It's consistent. Now I'm curious about you. Have you ever stayed quiet to preserve peace only to realize later that your silence was being interpreted as weakness? I'd genuinely like to know how you handled it. Let's talk in the comments.